We're going to move into talking about how energy is transferred through an environment. And so we're going to take a look at food chains and food webs. Food chains and food webs are two different ways that we can learn about and essentially diagram energy flow within an environment. So a food chain is a linear depiction of energy flow. On the right here, we have two examples of food chains. One with plants going up to snakes, and one with phytoplankton, which is a photosynthetic protist, all the way up through pelicans. So the arrow in a food chain or in a food web is going to indicate the direction of energy flow. So the caterpillar is going to eat the plant and thereby gain energy. Energy is going to be transferred from the plant to the caterpillar. Each level in our food chain is called a trophic level, and trophic is related to energy. So we can think of this as an energy level within our food chain. We've talked several times about photosynthesis already. Our primary producers, those organisms that are autotrophs, generally are photosynthetic organisms, are going to be the primary energy source in a food web or in a food chain. Energy source. So our lowest energy level with the highest amount of energy is going to be our primary producers, because these are the ones that are bringing in energy from the environment, capturing it and converting it into chemical energy. Above them, we have our primary consumers. The primary consumers are directly eating the producers. So these are usually going to be our herbivores. Above that, we start to see secondary and tertiary consumer levels. These are going to be our carnivores. Now you'll notice that carnivores are in either of two different levels in this diagram, and that's because we have a first level carnivore that's eating the herbivore, and then a second carnivore that's eating the first carnivore. So we can continue a little bit higher. Generally, we don't have more than tertiary or quaternary consumers, and we'll talk about why that is a little bit later. But the trophic level describes the position in the food chain as it relates to energy. So our tertiary consumer is essentially the fourth energy level if we consider the primary producer down there at the bottom. Now, a food chain is great for showing us the basic energy flow in a ecosystem, but it doesn't tell us the whole picture. It shows us a very simplified picture, a linear flow of energy, and it does not take into account that some organisms might occupy more than one trophic level, and some organisms might be eating food from multiple different sources. So this is where a food web comes in. And a food web is a more complex model of interconnected food chains. So what we do with a food chain is sort of food webs. We overlay multiple food chains and we can get a more complex idea of the interactions happening with respect to energy. Now the same thing applies here. These are all trophic levels. And these trophic levels are the same. We've got primary producers. These are our photosynthesizers or our autotrophs. We've got our primary consumers. These are the herbivores. And then we've got our secondary consumers. These are the carnivores. So let's take a look at some of these. On the bottom, we have grasses and trees. So these are obviously our plants. Let's start with this red oat grass. Now, red oat grass is being consumed by all of these different herbivores, but let's look at the grasshopper. So energy is moving from that red oat grass to our grasshopper. So as that grasshopper eats the grass, some of the energy from the grass is transferred to the grasshopper. From there, our grasshopper that is an herbivore is being eaten by wildebeests. So that makes our wildebeest a primary, a secondary consumer. Our grasshopper is that primary consumer. Our wildebeest is the secondary consumer. But this is where it gets complicated. That wildebeest can eat the grasshopper, but the wildebeest can also act as an herbivore and eat that red oat grass. So if we look at the wildebeest with respect to the oat grass, he is in fact a primary consumer because he's eating our plant materials. Likewise, if we move up the chain, we can see that the hyena up there shows a similar pattern. The topee is eating the oat grass, and then the hyena is eating the topee. So that makes the hyena a primary consumer. But we also see that he is a higher level consumer as well. So this oat grass is eaten by the harvester ant, so they're the primary consumer. The aardvark eats the ant, he's the secondary consumer. The hyena eats the aardvark, so now he becomes a tertiary consumer. So you can see that in a real situation, our food webs and energy transfers are far more complex than a food chain is going to imply. If we want to manage the energy in our environment, we're going to want to manage those primary producers. This is because the more primary production we have, the more primary producers we have, the more energy we have. So more primary production means more energy. And if there's more energy, we can support more higher level consumers in our environment. So let's talk about our trophic levels just a little bit more. There's not really too much else to say. So our primary producers form the base of the food chain. This is going to be the source of all energy in the ecosystem. Because until that sunlight or chemical energy is transferred, that energy is not actually available to power any processes within the cell. So our autotrophs, these are the organisms that produce energy produce chemical energy and store it into carbon bonds as usable cellular energy. So autotrophs are going to either convert light or chemical energy into usable energy for cells. You are all familiar with our photosynthesizers. So our plants, algae, cyanobacteria, those are all photoautotrophs. But we can also have chemical autotrophs or chemoautotrophs. These are organisms that take inorganic compounds, such as sulfur-containing compounds, sulfur-containing compounds and convert them into usable sulfur-containing bonds or sulfur bonds that store energy. We're going to continue to focus on our photoautotrophs for this course, but keep in mind there's some organisms, some bacteria that can take inorganic molecules and convert them into energy storing organic molecules. Then, of course, we've got our heterotrophs. These are organisms that have to acquire their energy by eating other organisms. So they cannot produce their own energy from inorganic sources. They have to rely on other plants or bacteria in order to do that. Again, our primary consumers are those that eat primary producers. So these are always going to be our herbivores. These are always going to be organisms that are consuming plants, phytoplankton, algae, or cyanobacteria. These are all of our photosynthesizers. So those herbivores are going to consume those organisms. Anything higher than primary is going to be a higher level consumer. These guys are going to be the ones that are eating our primary consumers. So these are going to be our herbivores. Sorry, they're eating the herbivores. These are going to be our carnivores. And those carnivores, as you saw on the slide with the food chain from the African savanna, can occupy multiple levels within a food chain, or within a food web, I should say. Then we have detritivores and decomposers. So detritivores are organisms that eat dead organisms. And decomposers are also organisms that eat dead waste, except the decomposers are breaking them down all the way into their smallest nutrients. In general, I'm going to kind of use these interchangeable. They're technically a little bit different, but for our purposes, they're doing the same thing. They are consuming plant and animal remains and breaking down our waste products. So detritivores and decomposers are not considered a trophic level themselves. They are organisms that act at all trophic levels, except for autotrophic primary producer. So they can be considered essentially at the primary consumer level if they're breaking down plants. They can be considered a secondary consumer if they're breaking down dead waste from an herbivore. So these guys don't have their own level. They don't wait and only eat those top carnivores. They decompose anything that used to be living into small components. So detritivores play a crucial role in breaking down dead and organic matter. So when an organism dies, it is decomposed by bacteria and fungi. They're also really important in recycling nutrients back into the environment, specifically into the soil. So as this organic matter breaks down, the nutrients are put back into the soil where plants can then pull them back up and bring it back into our food web. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later in a later chapter. And because they recycle nutrients, put them back into the soil, they're also helping to support other organisms within that food web. Common detritivores are going to be earthworms and millipedes that break down matter within the soil. Dung beetles break down feces. And then there are a variety of fungi and bacteria that do this job as well. So in most food webs and in food chains, the chain lengths are going to be short. The reason is with every energy transfer, we see a loss of energy. So every time one organism consumes something from a lower trophic level, some energy is lost in between. So if you think about it, some of the energy that a plant brings in is going to be used for cellular processes, its own metabolism. Some is going to be put into structures like the cell wall that an herbivore can't fully break down. And so the fibers are going to be passed through the herbivore. So any energy that is contained in the bonds there is also going to be lost. So by the time we get up to our higher level carnivores, there's not a lot of energy that's left compared to the energy that was initially fixed by those primary producers. So our chain length is generally going to have 3 to 4 levels. If we go back and look at the food webs and food chains from previous slides, they have a primary producer, a primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. So only 4 levels. Usually we can only get up to 6. That's about as much as the environment can hold, but in general, most environments can only support 3 to 4 levels. And this is really just based on laws of physics and laws of chemistry. So the laws of thermodynamics say that energy conversion is not 100% efficient. That means every time there's a chemical reaction, some energy is lost. Every time there's an energy transfer, some energy is lost. And most of that energy that is lost as heat. But much of it is lost also as energy that cannot be processed by the next trophic level.